In case you haven't heard yet, there was a recent exploit on Apple devices. I know what you're thinking.
Apple is no stranger to hacks and exploits.
What makes this particular exploit special is its complex execution, as well as the severe hardware vulnerability that allowed this attack to happen. In this video, I'll be covering the details of this attack, as well as my thoughts on the situation of Apple devices. This past December, researchers from Kaspersky revealed a sophisticated exploit, which allowed thousands of Apple devices to essentially become backdoored for the past 4 years. This included Macs, iPods, iPads, the Apple TV, and the Apple Watch. The most concerning aspect of this exploit is that it relied on an undocumented hardware feature that few people, outside of Apple and CPU suppliers, would have known about. As of today, it's still unknown what the purpose of this secret feature actually is, and Apple hasn't responded to any inquiries. However, the vulnerabilities the attackers used to execute this exploit have since been patched by Apple. This attack collected things such as microphone recordings, photos, geolocation data, and other sensitive information. The data was then transmitted to malicious servers controlled by the attackers. The exploit was accomplished by combining 4 other vulnerabilities, plus the secret hardware feature to gain high-level access to the devices. The attack is initiated by receiving a malicious iMessage attachment, which the Messenger application processes without notifying the user. This proceeds into the TrueType font vulnerability, which then proceeded to 2 other vulnerabilities that targeted the iOS kernel. From there, a Safari vulnerability is used, which then uses the previous kernel vulnerabilities again. Root access is achieved, and the final payload of spyware is installed. For a more in-depth explanation, I suggest checking out the research article released by Kaspersky. Although these vulnerabilities could be stopped by rebooting the infected device, the attackers would restart the infection by sending additional malicious iMessages. Unfortunately, the secret hardware feature is a permanent fixture on the device and cannot be removed. At the time of Kaspersky's reveal, the identity of the attackers was still a mystery and is still the current case. Although accusations have been made toward Apple working with the NSA, an Apple representative has obviously denied the allegations. The Kaspersky researchers have acknowledged they don't have evidence to support that theory. In fact, the researchers admit the attack itself is so unique that it doesn't fit the patterns of any known threat actors. All that's known is that the attackers had intimate knowledge of Apple's undocumented hardware feature, which made this complex attack even possible in the first place. Kaspersky researchers are exploring all possibilities, from reverse engineering to accidental disclosure of past firmware code releases. Obviously, the secret hardware function is a massive red flag that everyone should be concerned about. As Mental Outlaw points out, this is basically a repeat of Intel's Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities all over again.
But what's even spookier than gaining root access to what is supposed to be one of the most secure types of smartphones on the planet is the way that attackers were able to gain this access through an exploit in the iPhone's CPU architecture. Oh yeah, you remember the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities from like 5+ years ago at this point? Well, we're doing them again, except this time it's with ARM CPUs that are built into the iPhones and Apple's system-on-a-chip design.
So now we're left with a few possibilities. The implementation and secrecy of the hardware function was intentional on Apple's part. The function was a leftover from CPU development and was either forgotten or ignored by Apple. So was it intentional, incompetence, or negligence? Hopefully time will tell. The whole situation does make you wonder what else Apple could be potentially hiding in your devices. Of course, we'll never know because of Apple hardware and software being a proprietary black box. Or I should say, we won't know until another massive breach occurs or a whistleblower comes forward. As far as who I think did this attack, I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't dismiss the possibility of an Apple and NSA partnership, especially since most of the targets were government officials and diplomats. I also wouldn't dismiss the idea of a rogue employee selling the exploit. Or perhaps this was done by an activist group looking to simultaneously expose these officials and Apple's secret hardware function. Did you really think I'd go without critiquing TechLore's response? Not surprisingly, Henry is white knighting for Apple, going so far as to whine about misinformation and disinformation.
The amount of misinformation and possibly disinformation I'm seeing over this story is out of this world. People claiming that Apple has backdoored all iPhones, people saying that Apple allowed there to be backdoors on their iPhones. But let's just dive right into this, because a lot of people just have clearly not read this story.
Keep in mind what he said about people not reading the article. That'll be important very shortly.
You can actually see the insane attack chain that was required to pull off this attack, which actually was dependent on 4 different vulnerabilities in order to pull off, all in conjunction. But those people reverse engineered the chipset on iOS devices in order to also be able to pull this off.
No, they didn't.
The article clearly states that reverse engineering was a potential method, not a definitive one. The article also states that Kaspersky was investigating other possibilities, including accidental disclosures. Perhaps Henry should actually read the article before quoting it, and definitely before opening his mouth to criticize others for not reading.
Now, one thing before I get into more of my personal analysis on this, just objectively speaking, this is not something most of you are going to have to worry about. These are highly sophisticated, highly targeted attacks that don't impact the general public. And if you're asking if I should be worrying about this, you probably shouldn't. These are things that are being utilized against politicians, journalists, and frankly, probably high-level activists as well. Which again, I'm not saying those are good things. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a better situation to this, but that's the situation.
Sorry, but people should be concerned about this. This vulnerability is on the hardware level, and as we all know, the hardware is identical across device families. These targeted officials had typical Apple devices that anyone would have, with no special modifications made. We already have AI models being trained to create malware easily, and yet you're so naive to think the average person shouldn't worry about this.
Next, ChatGPT written malware. So ChatGPT is this new AI that has been coming out. If you haven't heard of it, definitely check it out. It's interesting stuff, and you should probably look into it if you're into technology in any way. The cybercriminal community has already shown significant interest and are jumping into this latest trend to generate malicious code. The article notes that the code itself is usually riddled with flaws, but it's good enough to be a starting point. Schneier himself notes that this also has the potential to enable script kiddies as it improves, especially possibly with increasingly dangerous capabilities. So very interesting stuff to see how AI is going to be utilized and if we're going to start seeing AI written malware.
You really don't think an attacker could acquire a huge list of leaked phone numbers, send out a malicious iMessage in a wide net, and see what they catch? Clearly someone hasn't been paying attention to their own news reports.
Now there is one question I have, which a lot of people have, in fact the researcher themselves have. There was a hardware component to this in the ARM chip, which they don't know what the purpose for that was, and it was a part of this exploit process, but it was just a part of it. And of course, people are instantly running away with this, thinking it's some Apple built-in backdoor, when not even the researcher implies that, nor does the researcher seem to believe that, nor does anyone who has any kind of authority on this matter, who knows what they're talking about, believe that. It just seems like that there's some weird feature on this chip, likely from ARM or from Apple, they don't know yet, that was part of the exploit process, kind of like how iMessage could have been used as part of the exploit for the messages that were sent via iMessage. It's not that iMessage in itself is inherently harmful, it's that the features within iMessage could have been exploited because of the attack surface provided by those things. So again, this is something I do want answered, but the fact that people are running away with this with crazy conspiracy theories is objectively just not where any of the data or evidence is currently pointing.
Here's yet another example of Henry not reading the article. The article clearly states it was a mass backdooring campaign, but of course Henry wants to argue over semantics. You can debate whether or not it was intentionally designed by Apple or ARM. The fact remains that all parts of this attack were combined to open a backdoor, and this secret hardware function was a key component. I don't know what's more concerning, that Henry is brushing this off as nothing or that he's downplaying Apple devices having an undocumented function.
The other thing I'll add before the personal analysis is Lockdown mode prevents this. Okay, so Apple released that feature, lockdown mode, which I made a whole video about. So I'd really check out that video if you want to learn more about lockdown mode. Lockdown mode has definitely some things that I would say will make your device less convenient to use. I would not suggest lockdown mode to just everybody out there.
That's not what you've said before. In fact, you've encouraged people to build up lockdown mode's effectiveness by using it.
Another iOS security researcher they interviewed in the article recommends that everyone turn on lockdown mode if they can to help the people who need it blend in, kind of like using Tor. So if you're an iOS user, when iOS 16 comes out, I would say go ahead and give lockdown mode a try. If it doesn't interfere with your life and things go fine, maybe leave it on, help people out if you can. Same thing with Tor. If anyone was wondering, lockdown mode, we still think you should enable it when you can because it helps make those people less fingerprintable, but unfortunately, it is victim to the same flaws that Apple does not seem to care about.
So actually what really sparked me to make this video is I recently made the 2023 Digital Rights Awards thing, and I gave Apple the award for their lockdown mode because in my eyes, I still, at the time of recording this too, think that I haven't seen anybody else come forward and provide journalists directly the kind of tools necessary to protect themselves. And Apple's done that.
No, the real reason you made this video was for damage control, because in your eyes, Apple is the best company for privacy and security. You did the same thing when Apple's privacy toggle did nothing, and instead you rambled on about first-party versus third-party privacy.
All right, let's start with the highlight story. Apple is tracking you even when its own privacy settings say it's not, new research says. A lot of you are already like, well, duh, it's Apple. And it's like, well, okay, we need research and we need ways to actually verify this kind of stuff because that's what this whole podcast and that's what we honestly all should be doing. Now, the research is interesting, so let's listen up here. The App Store appeared to harvest information about every single thing you did in real time, including what you tapped on, which apps you searched for, what ads you saw, and how long you looked at a given app, and how you found it. The app sent details about you and your device as well, including ID numbers, what kind of phone you're using, your screen resolution, your keyboard languages, how you're connected to the internet, notably the kind of information commonly used for device fingerprinting. Now here's the kicker. Opting out or switching the personalization options off did not reduce the amount of detailed analytics that the app was sending. This research was done by MISC, and that's what MISC said. MISC also said they switched off all possible options, namely personalized ads, personalized recommendations, and sharing usage data and analytics. Here's where it's a little bit more nuanced, and maybe things aren't as bad as they sound. The researchers said that the health and wallet apps, for example, didn't transmit any analytics data at all, regardless of whether the iPhone analytics setting was on or off. Whereas this kind of tracking was found in Apple Music, Apple TV, Books, the iTunes Store, and Stocks. Most of the apps that sent analytics data shared consistent ID numbers, which would allow Apple to track your activity across those services. MISC also says that these findings are kind of out of line with standard industry practices, even with companies like Google and Microsoft, because he and his research partner ran similar tests in the past looking at analytics for Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge, and in both of those apps, they say that when you turn analytics off, they actually don't transmit this kind of data. They also finalized this by tying this back to Apple's marketing, which is, they're saying it's not tracking unless you're linking together data collected from services owned by different companies, which they're saying is Apple's stance, because if only one company, Apple, is collecting the data, then by Apple's definition, it's not tracking. But if third parties are doing it, then it is considered tracking, which is a very different definition than other people seem to be using. So here's my takeaway from the story here. First, this issue wasn't equally applicable across all Apple services. It does seem like this was mostly happening in the Apple applications where there can be advertising, or there's a clear revenue model like Apple Music. With that said, more sensitive things like wallets and health actually transmitted none of this information, which you're probably not going to find in many other services out there. And it seems like the researchers only found this kind of tracking inside these applications, so this doesn't seem to be an OS-wide problem, fortunately. At least no more than we already know Apple collects on an operating system level, which doesn't seem to be anything super intense. The ultimate issue here is there's no way to opt out, and the opt-out actually does effectively nothing, and this kind of outlines once again Apple's definition of privacy is to prevent third-party tracking, but not first-party tracking, which is something we say back here pretty darn often. My concern here, obviously, is the opt-out doesn't do anything, and it should. And my long-term concern is, now that we know Apple collects this information in mostly apps with advertising, and Apple has also announced it is trying to enter advertising more, will we see more of this tracking on Apple devices and other applications? Time will tell. Again, even Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge seem to respect the toggles not to track you. With all of this said, and before you throw your iPhone out the window, I like to add perspective on this. It's been found in other research articles that even first-party data collection is collected less on iPhones than Android devices, so I wouldn't be pushing people away from iPhones for this reason alone, unless they're able to move to some kind of open source custom ROM or some other alternative, because frankly, Google is still a lot more invasive than Apple on an operating system level, and it comes with less aggressive stances towards third parties accessing your data. So I would argue out of the box, iPhone versus stock Android, it's still a downgrade if you move to an Android device. I'm very curious to see how Apple responds to this, especially now that, surprise, I didn't bring this up the whole time. There's actually a class action lawsuit against Apple filed in California accusing Apple of violating the California Invasion of Privacy Act. So Apple's lips have been absolutely shut about this entire story, but they can't be shut forever. There's now a lawsuit. So this story should get juicy when Apple decides to open their mouth and talk about why this is happening and why there is no transparency behind it. And really, the real issue here, again, we can't ignore the real issue. The opt-out doesn't do anything. If the opt-out did something, this would be kind of a non-issue. Again, like the default by tracking, yeah, we wish it wasn't happening, but like if you can opt out of it, generally that seems fine. The real issue is the opt-out and why the opt-out does nothing.
Speaking of your precious lockdown mode, I haven't heard you mention the trade-off of using this feature.
So the guys over at Wired decided to give this a try. This is Lily Newman, tried to give this a try and said that it was actually, modern iteration is actually quite functional and usable. It just takes a little bit of separation. I like this general approach, and I don't know, I think maybe they should start promoting this a little bit more. I think the downside of this is it's not going to protect your privacy from Apple anymore. So it's not like a privacy solution. It just protects you from the rest of the internet anymore. And that really is that differential that we're starting to see. So it can give you that false sense of security in thinking it's like the incognito mode, right? We did the article on that earlier this week. People were using incognito mode thinking that Google couldn't see what they're doing. No, it just protected other people from knowing what you're doing. Google can still see, Facebook can still see, everybody can still see. It's just not those guys. So Apple can still see everything that is going on. Everything that's going on. This does not protect you anything from Apple, but it does do significant things against anybody that might be targeting you. So turning it on does do a lot to protect you against malicious attacks against your data and other type services. But what it doesn't do is protect you against privacy invasions from Apple itself. And so with that in mind, just understand that it is something that is out there and it is usable, but just be aware of the issues.
Pretty sure that's a very important disclaimer that viewers should know about, especially if you're promoting Apple for privacy and security. As usual, leave it to Henry to omit such things and only offer light criticisms against his favorite company.
And people who are going, well, they shouldn't have been exploited in the first place, that's frankly not a good take, because everything is exploited. Are you going to tell me that the countless Linux vulnerabilities should have just been avoided? That's not what happens. So every operating system, every piece of software is going to have vulnerabilities which can be exploited, and that's a basic rule of life. Doesn't matter how secure something is, there is always a way to exploit it. What you need to look at is people's response to it and the kind of precautions and tools and also additional security precautions they're providing their customers to help mitigate the kind of damage that an exploit can cause them.
Henry isn't wrong on this point. Nothing is foolproof, and nothing is completely invulnerable to being exploited. That being said, it's suspicious that a company known for keeping a tight leash on the manufacturing of their devices wouldn't know about this hardware feature in the first place. Of course, it's not like Apple hasn't ignored serious issues before.
This week, which is that iOS VPNs have leaked traffic for more than 2 years, according to a researcher. But he says that VPNs on iOS leak traffic. The original story I saw was the actual research paper, and I kind of skimmed it. I recommend you read it. It gets pretty technical, but it's also easy to understand in some areas. If I understood it correctly, this happens kind of randomly, and it's also kind of hard for the average user to detect. Like, you could do it with a packet sniffer such as Wireshark, but not everyone knows how to spin up Wireshark and watch their traffic. So again, really hard to know. Everything from your end as the end user seems like it's working fine, but there's little bits of content leaking here and there. Proton also claims that they reported this to Apple 2 years ago, but says that Apple hasn't done anything about it. And just to be clear, this is an Apple limitation. This isn't like a Proton limitation, an IVPN limitation. This isn't a VPN limitation. This is Apple. Apple needs to fix things on their side so that this works. Having said that, Apple claims that they have fixed it. I believe they're talking about the kill switch because Proton said that, yeah, they partially fixed it. And that, again, if I'm understanding all these articles right, that coincides around the same time that Proton released the kill switch on iOS. But the researcher said kill switch doesn't even do anything. Like, it's completely ineffective, so it's not really a full fix. And also, Proton claims that the fix Apple rolled out made exceptions for Apple services, so Apple services can still connect even when the VPN is supposed to be killing traffic. So, lovely little case of them giving themselves extra permissions and exceptions, as unfortunately companies do.
Richmond homeowner says that Find My iPhone app mistake was causing angry residents to come to his house. So this is from Texas, and they said that almost a dozen people kept knocking on his door at all hours of the day and night, claiming he stole their lost items because of what he said is a mistake on the Find My iPhone application. Scott Schuster, who has lived in his home since 2018, said this has been going on every few months over the last few years. Most of the people who show up are visibly upset or frustrated. One person caught on his doorbell camera even threatened to call the police. Schuster is not sure why the Find My iPhone application is pinging his address either. He's a software engineer with his own theories, but he has no way of knowing for sure. He is adamant that this is a huge mistake and worries that it could turn dangerous. He said he's just upset about the people showing up at his door because he has 2 young children, 7 and 9, and worries for their safety. This is definitely interesting because it seems like no one knows what's going on, and for whatever reason, Apple's Find My iPhone is telling people that their stolen items are at this person's house, so...
Okay, with all that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and jump into the highlight story, which is pretty troubling. The headline says, iPhones have been exposing your unique MAC address despite Apple's promises otherwise. 3 years ago, I think they said it was in iOS 14, Apple introduced a privacy-enhancing feature that hid the Wi-Fi address of iPhones and iPads when they joined a network. On Wednesday, the world learned that the feature has never worked as advertised. Despite promises that this never-changing address would be hidden and replaced with a private one that was unique to each Wi-Fi network, or SSID, Apple devices have continued to display the real one, which in turn got broadcast to every other connected device on the network. So this past week, Apple rolled out iOS 17.1, which included several fixes, but among them, it includes this fix. So lesson number 1, be sure to update, because this fixed a thing that we didn't even know was an issue. One security researcher who was credited with discovering and reporting this vulnerability, he said, quote, "From the get-go, this feature was useless because of this bug. We couldn't stop the device from sending these discovery requests even with a VPN, even in the lockdown mode," which is extra troubling for lockdown mode, which the article says. Some kind of very light details on how it worked for those curious. They said, quote, "Digging in a little further, it became clear that the real permanent MAC address was still broadcast to other connected devices, just in a different field of the request. So it was still visible, it just wasn't in the MAC address field." They said, in fairness to Apple, the feature wasn't useless because it did prevent passive sniffing, but the failure to remove the real MAC address still meant that anyone connected to a network could pull the unique identifiers with no trouble, which, as we said, could be an issue if you're a targeted person. Apple has not explained how a failure as basic as this one escaped notice for so long.
It's actually extremely disingenuous to say that Apple should have just known about this, because no one who says that is going to apply that kind of reasoning to the software they like.
Disingenuous? That's rich coming from the guy promoting Apple products for privacy, despite a clear history that shows anti-privacy and anti-consumer practices. Or how about promoting Signal as a privacy-focused messenger, despite requiring a sensitive piece of personal info such as a phone number?
Again, I actually really want to commend Apple for this. I wish everybody did this, and that's why it's frustrating for me. I think there's so many things that Apple deserves so much crap for. Lockdown mode is not one of them. Please do not criticize Apple for lockdown mode in the way that our community's been doing, because it's actually really something that the community needs. I would love to see Linux get a lockdown mode. I would love to see really every piece of software that I use get a lockdown mode. And I think it would just be fantastic for the entire community. So I think it's really just not a good thing to just blatantly attack this because it's from Apple, when Apple has quite literally enabled all of us to be able to help fight one of quite literally the most sophisticated exploits ever found. So...
Or they could have just not included the super secret hardware function in their chips from the beginning. You remember that hardware vulnerability that even allowed this attack to move forward. But hey, if you just want to be completely oblivious to Apple's flaws and promote them, hoping Senpai will notice you, go right ahead.